Welcome to Shadow Frames, where forgotten images reveal their darkest secrets. Behind every preserved moment, there often lurks an unexplained presence, a detail that defies understanding, a shadow that shouldn't be there. Today, we examine one such anomaly, a wedding photograph taken in 1909 that has perplexed historians and descendants alike for generations. The photograph appears ordinary at first glance, a sepia-toned celebration captured outside a small rural church. The bride stands radiant in her white lace gown, intricate beadwork catching the afternoon sun. Her groom beside her, tall and proud in his formal attire, his mustache meticulously groomed in the fashion of Edwardian gentlemen. Surrounding them, nearly 24 wedding guests beam with joy, their Sunday best displaying the modest prosperity of early 20th century middle-class America. For over a century, this image passed through family albums, a cherished heirloom documenting the union of two families in that spring day of 1909. The names of everyone were carefully recorded on the back: the bride's parents, the groom's sisters, childhood friends, elderly aunts, all accounted for with fading ink annotations. Everyone, that is, except for one figure. Directly behind the bride, partially obscured by her veil and almost blending into the church's shadowed entrance, stands a man, tall, unnaturally thin, wearing what appears to be formal attire but somehow different from the other guests. His features are difficult to discern. Whether from the photograph's age or the shadows falling across his face remains unclear. What makes this presence particularly disturbing isn't merely his unidentified status. It's that, according to all wedding accounts, guest lists, and family records, he wasn't invited. No one remembered seeing him that day. Not the bride's family, who organized the ceremony, nor the groom's relatives who traveled from 3 states away to attend. Not the pastor who performed the service, nor the children who gathered rose petals. Yet there he stands, impossibly present in a moment where every other face has a name, a relation, a purpose for being there. More unsettling still are the subsequent discoveries made by the couple's descendants. When comparing this photograph to other family images from the era, they noticed something chilling. The same unidentified figure appears in the background of 5 other family photographs spanning 15 years. At a christening, a funeral, a harvest festival, always distant, always watching, always unknown. The bride and groom would go on to have 4 children, living what appeared to be a blessed life in their small community. But their firstborn daughter's diary, discovered in an attic trunk in 1972, revealed something the family had never spoken of: her mother's periodic episodes of terror, her insistence that someone was watching their home from the edge of their property, particularly on significant family occasions. Who was this man that no one invited yet appeared at the most important moment in this couple's life? What connection did he have to the family that seemingly no one recognized? And perhaps most disturbing of all, why does he appear to be smiling in a way unlike anyone else in the photograph? The photograph found its way to my research desk at the Historical Society through Martha Holloway, great-granddaughter of the bride. I specialize in photographic anomalies of the early 20th century. Yet even I was unprepared for the chill that ran through me when I first examined the image under proper archival lighting. "There's something about his posture," I told Martha during our initial consultation. "The way he stands, it's almost as if he's hovering rather than standing on solid ground." Martha nodded, unsurprised by my observation. My grandmother, the couple's second daughter, used to say her mother would sometimes wake screaming about the man who doesn't touch the earth. The family attributed it to migraine hallucinations. The 1909 wedding took place in Millfield, a once prosperous mining community that has since dwindled to a few hundred residents. The church itself still stands, though abandoned since 1963 after a mysterious structural failure collapsed the bell tower during a service, killing 3 parishioners. I traveled to Millfield last autumn, photograph in hand. The town records revealed something I hadn't expected. The land where the church was built had been the site of a public execution in 1872. A man named Edmund Thorne had been hanged for the murders of 5 women in neighboring counties. Comparing Thorne's only known photograph from court records with our mysterious wedding guest proved inconclusive. The shadowy figure's features too indistinct for positive identification. However, one detail caught my attention. Court records described Thorne as unusually tall and gaunt, with a distinctive manner of holding himself, as though perpetually leaning forward. The bride's journal, which Martha reluctantly shared, contained scattered references to dreams where she found herself unable to move. watching a tall figure methodically circling their farmhouse. "He never comes closer," she wrote in 1922, "but each night completes another circle, like the winding of some terrible clock." Most disturbing were the entries following the birth of each child. The bride described seeing the figure standing at the foot of her hospital bed, bending as if in examination of the new baby, his face split by a smile no human mouth should make. I commissioned a photographic restoration specialist to enhance the wedding image using modern techniques. The results arrived yesterday. The enhancement revealed something the sepia tones and age had obscured, while every guest cast appropriate shadows in the bright spring sunlight. The tall man behind the bride cast none. Even more unsettling was what appeared on his hands. What we had assumed were gloves now clearly showed elongated fingers ending in points too sharp for human anatomy, and his eyes, previously lost in shadow, now reflected the light in a way that produced two perfect white discs where eyes should be. Martha called this morning, her voice shaking. She'd found another family photograph in her late mother's effects, a picture of her own wedding in 1970. In the background, barely visible through the church window, stands a tall, thin figure in outdated formal attire, watching the ceremony unfold. The archived church records from Millfield revealed another layer to this mystery. According to documents I uncovered beneath decades of dust, Edmund Thorne wasn't merely executed for murder. He had specifically targeted brides. Each victim had been newly married when she disappeared, only to be found weeks later arranged in wedding finery that wasn't their own. The court testimonies described Thorne as obsessed with matrimonial ceremonies, often seen lingering outside churches during weddings despite having no connection to the families involved. More unsettling still were the personal effects recovered from Thorne's residence after his arrest. A collection of wedding veils, carefully preserved despite the bloodstains marking each one. His final words before the hanging were recorded by the prison chaplain. "Death isn't enough to keep me from the ceremonies. I'll attend them all eventually." I brought this information to Martha during our meeting at the county library. Her hands trembled as she pushed another photograph across the table, one I hadn't seen before. "This was taken the night before my great-grandfather died," she whispered. 1942. The image showed the elderly groom from our wedding photo, now a widower of 3 years, sitting alone on his porch. The exposure was poor, likely taken with an amateur's hand, but unmistakable in the background was a tall figure standing at the property line. This time he wasn't maintaining his customary distance. He appeared to be approaching the house. "Great-grandfather was found the next morning," Martha continued. "The doctor called it heart failure, but family stories say his face showed an expression of pure terror." Local newspaper archives yielded another connection I hadn't anticipated. Before becoming the site of the church, the land had been owned by Thorne himself. He'd purchased it with the intention of building a home, but lost the property when his crimes came to light. The church construction began less than a year after his execution, built directly over the foundation he had started. The pattern of appearances began to take clearer shape as I mapped them chronologically. The figure wasn't simply haunting the family randomly. He appeared exclusively at transitions, births, deaths, weddings, moments when the veil between one state of existence and another grew thin. I consulted Dr. Eleanor Wharton, a colleague specializing in folklore surrounding 19th century criminal cases. Her assessment chilled me further. "There's a belief dating back centuries," she explained, "that certain individuals could bind themselves to bloodlines through obsession, not necessarily their own family, but any lineage they developed a fixation upon. Thorne seems to have attached himself to this bride's line, perhaps seeing her wedding as an event that should have been his to witness. When I returned to re-examine the church grounds, I discovered renovation plans from 1960, 3 years before the bell tower collapse. The renovations had disturbed the original foundation, specifically the cornerstone laid during initial construction in 1873. The construction foreman's journal, preserved in the county historical archives, noted something unusual. Embedded within the original cornerstone, they'd discovered a small cloth pouch containing human teeth, hair, and what appeared to be a wedding band that matched no record from the church's matrimonial history. The journal's final entry regarding the discovery read only, "Resealed as found. Some things are better left undisturbed." Following the discovery of the disturbed cornerstone, I found myself drawn deeper into the Thorne connection. Local folklore specialist Henrietta Mills agreed to meet me at Millfield's only remaining cafe, bringing with her a collection of regional superstitions documented by her grandmother. In rural communities of the late 1800s, wedding ceremonies weren't just social occasions, Henrietta explained, sliding a weathered journal across the table. They were moments of vulnerability, times when malevolent entities could attach themselves to families. The journal described a protection ritual once common in Millfield weddings: silver pins hidden in bridal bouquets, salt sewn into hemlines, mirrors covered during the ceremony to prevent unwanted entities from seeing their reflection and gaining permanence in our world. "The bride in your photograph," Henrietta observed, tapping the image. "Her bouquet contains no protective herbs, just fashionable roses. And look at the church doorway. The threshold isn't lined with salt as was customary." My research led me to Evelyn Sanders, now 97, whose mother had been a childhood friend of the bride. I visited her at the county nursing home, where she sat surrounded by family photographs spanning a century. "Mother said there was something wrong with the ceremony," Evelyn recalled, her voice surprisingly strong despite her age. "The pastor performed it backward. Not obviously so, but certain prayers came in the wrong order. Nobody noticed except grandmother, who was quite traditional. She left before the reception." Evelyn's hands trembled as she passed me a small Bible, its leather cover cracked with age. "This belonged to my grandmother. Look at what she wrote after attending that wedding." Inside the cover, in faded script, "God forgive us for what was invited in today." The vows were spoken in reverse, creating not a binding, but an opening. When I returned to Martha with these findings, she revealed something she'd initially been too frightened to share: a recurring dream experienced by many women in her family. In it, they found themselves dressed in wedding finery, walking down the aisle toward not their actual husbands, but a tall, gaunt figure whose face remained in shadow. "The dreams always begin on significant anniversaries," Martha confided. "My great-grandmother's started on her 5th anniversary, my grandmother's on her 10th, my mother's on her 15th. I asked the question I'd been dreading. "And yours?" "My 20th wedding anniversary is next month," she whispered. "The dreams started last week." That evening, examining high-resolution scans of the wedding photo, I noticed something previously overlooked. The pastor performing the ceremony, his collar was worn incorrectly. In 1909, this subtle detail would have identified him as an imposter to those familiar with clerical dress. County records confirmed my growing suspicion. The regular pastor had fallen ill the morning of the wedding. His replacement, a traveling minister who had arrived in town just days before, performed the ceremony and departed immediately after. No forwarding address was recorded. The church registry listed his name as Reverend E. Thorne. The bride hadn't just been photobombed by a malevolent entity, she had been married by one. The ceremony itself was the ritual that bound Thorne to her bloodline, not as a haunting presence, but as a participant in every significant transition her descendants would ever experience. And Martha's anniversary was approaching. I arrived at Martha's home the evening before her anniversary, equipment in tow. We had agreed to monitor the night with recording devices, audio, video, and electromagnetic field detectors borrowed from a paranormal research colleague. Her husband Michael supported our efforts, though skepticism lined his face as he helped set up cameras in their bedroom. 20 years we've been married," he said, adjusting a tripod, "and I've never seen anything unusual, despite all the family stories." Martha touched his arm gently. "You've never been there when I wake from the dreams." The house settled into darkness around 11. I remained monitoring the equipment in their guest room while Martha and Michael attempted sleep. Outside, autumn winds stirred dry leaves across their lawn, the sound occasionally filtering through my headphones. At precisely 3:17 in the morning, every device simultaneously registered anomalies. Temperatures dropped 12 degrees in 30 seconds. Audio picked up what sounded like footsteps circling the house, precisely paced, methodical. The camera in the upstairs hallway showed nothing visually, but its built-in motion sensor repeatedly triggered. I watched the bedroom monitor as Martha began to stir, her sleep growing restless. Michael remained motionless beside her, his breathing deep and untroubled. When Martha suddenly sat upright, her eyes open but unfocused, I almost called out through the intercom system we'd established. What stopped me was the expression on her face. Not fear, but recognition. She slipped from bed without waking Michael and walked to their bedroom window. My breath caught as I switched to the exterior camera feed. Standing in the yard below, illuminated by moonlight, was the figure from the photographs, his outdated formal attire now clearly visible. his impossible height emphasized by the garden fence he stood beside. He raised one elongated hand toward the window in a beckoning gesture. Martha turned from the window and began walking toward their bedroom door. I rushed from the guest room, intercepting her in the hallway. Her eyes remained unfocused, her movements mechanical. "Martha," I whispered urgently, grasping her shoulders. "Wake up, you're dreaming." Her voice when she spoke wasn't her own. The timbre was wrong, deeper, with a cadence belonging to another era. "The ceremony remains incomplete," she said. "Each generation must honor the contract. 20 years is the final waiting." I pulled her away from the stairs she'd been approaching, but her strength was surprising. As we struggled in the darkened hallway, I recalled Henrietta's journal, thresholds, protections, the power of salt and silver. "Michael," I shouted, abandoning whispers. "Help me." Martha's husband burst from their bedroom as I fumbled with the small pouch of salt I'd brought as a precaution. As Michael reached for his wife, the lights throughout the house surged blindingly bright before plunging into darkness. When emergency power activated the recording equipment seconds later, the hallway camera revealed Martha standing perfectly still, Michael frozen mid-stride toward her, and behind them both, impossibly inside the house now, stood Edmund Thorne, his face finally visible in the equipment's infrared lighting. His smile extended too far across his face, eyes like empty wells in a gaunt visage. On the audio recording, beneath the sound of my own panicked breathing, his voice emerged clearly. "I've attended all the ceremonies. Now it's time for mine." The salt pouch slipped from my fingers as I lurched forward, desperate to reach Martha and Michael. Time seemed to stretch like taffy, each second an eternity as I watched Thorne place his elongated fingers on Martha's shoulder. Where he touched her, the fabric of her nightgown darkened, as though dampened. "The contract requires blood of the line," Thorne's voice rasped, now audible without the recording equipment. "A willing bride, every 4th generation." I recalled the bride's journal entries about dreams, about circling. The pattern suddenly crystallized. Thorne hadn't been randomly haunting the family. He'd been methodically preparing for this moment across decades, when Martha would become the 4th generation since the original bride. "She's not willing," Michael shouted, breaking free from whatever force had momentarily frozen him. "And she's already married," Thorne's laugh echoed like breaking glass. "The first ceremony was performed incorrectly by design. Your human rituals mean nothing against older contracts." I scrambled for the fallen salt pouch as Michael lunged toward his wife. Thorne's form seemed to ripple, becoming momentarily transparent before solidifying. The temperature plummeted further, my breath clouding before me. "What do you want?" I demanded, fingers finally closing around the protective salt. "Completion," Thorne answered simply. "The binding requires a bride from each 4th generation. Your modern world has forgotten the price of building sacred spaces upon cursed ground." Martha's eyes remained vacant, but tears now streamed down her cheeks. Whatever consciousness remained within her was fighting his influence. I recalled Henrietta's warnings about thresholds and boundaries. Thorne had manipulated the wedding ceremony a century ago, reversing the prayers to create an opening rather than a binding. Every appearance since, at births, deaths, celebrations, had been him maintaining his connection, strengthening it for this moment. "The execution," I said, sudden understanding washing over me. "You didn't just happen to be hanged on that property. You arranged it." Thorne's impossible smile widened. "Dying on consecrated ground while speaking the binding words. There is no stronger connection to this realm." I tore open the salt pouch and began drawing a hasty circle around Martha and myself, remembering the construction foreman's journal about the items found in the cornerstone. "The wedding band in the church foundation," I continued, working to keep him talking while completing the protective circle. "It was yours, not mine," Thorne corrected. "My mother's. The first sacrifice to my purpose." Michael moved to enter our circle, but I sharply waved him back. "Find silver," I hissed. "Anything silver in the house." As Michael retreated down the hallway, Thorne's form grew more substantial with each passing second. The walls around us began to warp subtly, wood grain flowing like water. The house itself seemed to breathe. 20 years of marriage marks the boundary," Thorne explained conversationally, as though discussing weather rather than supernatural abduction. 20 years of dreams preparing her. 20 years of me gaining strength through her bloodline's transitions, the birth of her children, the death of her father, the marriage of her cousin, each ceremony feeding the contract. Martha's vacant eyes suddenly cleared, focusing on Thorne with recognition and horror. "You," she whispered. "You've been waiting for me specifically." Thorne's nod was almost gentle. "The fourth bride, the last bride. After you, your family's debt will be paid in full." Michael returned breathlessly, clutching his grandmother's silver letter opener and a small jewelry box containing Martha's sterling earrings. His hands shook as he pressed them into my palm. "Complete the circle," I instructed, continuing my desperate improvisation based on fragmented folklore knowledge. As Michael scattered salt where I'd left off, I positioned the silver items at cardinal points around Martha. Thorne's form flickered like an old film projection, his expression transforming from confidence to wariness. The house creaked around us, timbers groaning as though under immense pressure. "Your protective measures are quaint," he said, voice now echoing strangely as though speaking from multiple locations simultaneously. "But the contract predates your understanding of containment." Martha's hands moved to her wedding ring, twisting it anxiously. "The wedding bands," she whispered, sudden clarity in her eyes. "That's what connects everything." She was right. The original church cornerstone contained a wedding band. The bride in the photograph wore one that had passed down through generations. Martha now wore her own, 20 years on her finger. "Michael," I urged, "your wedding band, quickly." As Michael removed his gold band, Thorne lunged forward, his form stretching impossibly across the hallway. The salt line sizzled where he approached it, giving off acrid smoke that burned my nostrils. "Place them together in the center," I instructed, arranging the silver objects to form a small square. Michael and Martha removed their rings, placing them within this makeshift altar. The effect was immediate and violent. Thorne's form contorted, his elongated limbs bending at unnatural angles as he recoiled from our improvised ritual. The walls vibrated, picture frames crashing to the floor. "You cannot break what was sealed in blood and bound by sacred words," Thorne hissed, his voice now multiplied into a chorus of identical tones. "The contract requires completion." Martha stood straighter within our protective circle, something of her ancestors' strength visibly flowing through her. "The contract required a willing bride from the fourth generation," she said firmly. "I do not consent." I seized upon this legal loophole. The original agreement was coerced through deception. A false priest, reversed vows. No binding contract exists. Thorne's form began to degrade at the edges, wisps of his substance dissolving like smoke in wind. Yet his terrifying smile remained intact, hovering in the increasingly insubstantial face. "Denial only delays," he warned. "What was started must be finished. If not by consent, then by taking." The air pressure in the hallway suddenly shifted, my ears popping painfully. The silver items at our feet began to oxidize before our eyes, tarnishing to black in seconds. "He's drawing power from somewhere else," I realized aloud. "The church foundation." Martha grabbed my arm. "The cornerstone. We need to destroy what's hidden there." As she spoke, the temperature plummeted further. Frost formed on the walls around us, crystalline patterns spreading like living things across the surface. "Dawn approaches," Thorne's dissipating form announced, his voice now distant. "I will retreat but not surrender. What was started in 1873 will be completed. The blood obligation remains." With this final pronouncement, his presence evaporated entirely, leaving behind only the lingering smell of damp earth and oxidized metal. The house settled back into normal creaks and ambient sounds. We stood in silence for several moments, processing what had transpired, before Martha spoke with newfound determination. "We need to get to the church ruins before nightfall tomorrow." The journey to Millfield's abandoned church proved more difficult than anticipated. Overnight storms had washed out the main access road, forcing us to approach on foot through dense woodland that had reclaimed much of the town's outskirts. Martha insisted on coming despite Michael's protests, her determination a palpable force as we trudged through mud and undergrowth. "My great-grandmother's diary mentioned something I didn't tell you," Martha said as we navigated the overgrown path. "She wrote about a sister no one else ever spoke of, a twin who died the night before the wedding. The family treated it as though she never existed. This revelation shifted everything." "A twin sister? That would change the generational pattern completely." Martha nodded grimly. "If my calculations are correct, I'm actually the fifth generation, not the fourth." We reached the church ruins as afternoon shadows lengthened across the overgrown cemetery. The collapsed bell tower had been further damaged by decades of neglect, its stones scattered like discarded toys across the weed-choked grounds. The cornerstone, however, remained intact, a large rectangular block bearing the faded inscription, "Founded in Faith, 1873. Michael set down our equipment, crowbars, chisels, flashlights, and a digital camera to document our findings. As I helped unpack, Martha wandered toward the adjacent cemetery, drawn to a far corner where wild roses had claimed an isolated plot. "There's something here," she called, voice tight with emotion. Joining her, we discovered a small, weathered headstone nearly hidden beneath vegetation. Clearing away the overgrowth revealed an inscription, "Elizabeth Harmon, beloved daughter, 1891 to 1909. The twin," I whispered. "She didn't die before the wedding, she died on the wedding day." Martha's face paled. "The bride in the photo isn't my great-grandmother Sarah. It's Elizabeth. They were identical." This explained why no one remembered the mysterious figure at the wedding. They were all focused on the wrong detail. It wasn't about who was unexpectedly present, but who was unexpectedly absent. As this realization sank in, a metallic gleam caught my eye in the soil near the headstone. Brushing away decades of accumulated earth revealed a tarnished locket. Inside, a tiny photograph showed two identical young women, their names engraved beneath, Sarah and Elizabeth, 1907. "Sarah wasn't the bride," Martha whispered, horror dawning on her face. "She was the one who made the deal with Thorne. She sacrificed her sister to escape being his bride herself, then took her sister's place in the family, marrying the man Elizabeth was supposed to marry." The wind picked up suddenly, clouds darkening overhead despite the earlier clear skies. The cornerstone of the church emitted a low, barely audible hum. The contract wasn't for a willing bride every fourth generation, I realized, pieces falling horrifically into place. It was for a twin sacrifice every time twins were born into the family line. Martha clutched the locket, her hands shaking. "My daughter," she whispered. "She's pregnant with twins. The first in our family since Sarah and Elizabeth." As thunder rolled across the darkening sky, we understood with sickening clarity that we weren't breaking a contract tonight. We were interrupting a cycle that had only just begun again. The cornerstone fought us with unnatural resistance. What should have been degraded mortar crumbled away in frustrating pinches despite our tools. As twilight deepened around the church ruins, Michael's crowbar finally dislodged a significant chunk, revealing a small cavity behind the dated inscription. "There," I whispered, training my flashlight into the darkness. The beam illuminated a cloth bundle, discolored by time yet remarkably preserved, bound with what appeared to be human hair braided into intricate knots. Martha reached forward instinctively, but I caught her wrist. "Don't touch it directly. We don't know what bindings might be triggered." Using gloved hands, I carefully extracted the bundle and placed it on the plastic tarp we'd brought. The moment it left the cornerstone, a sound like distant weeping drifted across the churchyard. The twisted roses on Elizabeth's grave shuddered, though no wind blew. The switch happened here, Martha realized, surveying the church's remaining structure. Elizabeth died, and Sarah took her place, all on the wedding day. The guests celebrated a union, while a body cooled somewhere in this building. Carefully unwrapping the cloth bundle, we discovered its contents: a wedding band engraved with Elizabeth's initials, several yellowed teeth, a lock of hair matching the shade in the locket's photograph, and most disturbingly, a contract written in faded brown ink, blood, almost certainly, on parchment that felt unnaturally warm to the touch. The document's elegant script detailed terms that confirmed our worst fears. Sarah had indeed bargained with Thorne, offering her twin as substitute bride in a spiritual ceremony that predated the physical wedding. In exchange, Sarah received her sister's intended life and Thorne's protection from discovery. The contract specified the cyclical nature of the arrangement. Whenever twins were born to the bloodline, one would be marked for Thorne. "My daughter doesn't know," Martha whispered, horror etched across her face. "The ultrasound only revealed the twins last week. According to this abomination, one baby is already claimed." Michael photographed the contract while I examined the church foundations more thoroughly. Behind a section of collapsed wall, I discovered a hidden chamber that had been exposed by the decades of decay. A small room that would have been directly beneath the altar. Inside, the remnants of an earlier structure were evident: Thorne's original foundation stones, incorporated into the church's construction. Carved into these stones were symbols I recognized from occult reference texts, binding sigils designed to anchor spirits to physical locations. The execution wasn't just convenient, I said, gesturing Martha and Michael over. It was planned. Thorn engineered his own death on this specific spot, knowing a church would likely be built here afterward. He created sacred ground through his sacrifice, then manipulated your family into an unbreakable covenant. As I spoke these words aloud, the temperature plummeted. The photographic equipment Michael had set up to document our discoveries abruptly activated, its flash firing repeatedly though no one touched it. Each burst illuminated a progressively more substantial outline of a tall figure standing beside Elizabeth's grave. "He's coming back," Martha gasped, clutching the locket. "But it's not night yet." "It doesn't need to be," I realized with dawning horror. "We've brought everything he needs to manifest right here together. The contract, the relics, and most importantly, the blood of the bloodline. You, Martha." The figure by the grave turned slowly toward us, its features resolving with each camera flash. The earth beneath our feet began to tremble as Thorn's manifestation strengthened with each passing moment. Wind swirled around the churchyard, carrying whispers that sounded like fragments of wedding vows spoken in reverse. Martha clutched the tarnished locket, her knuckles white with determination. "We need to destroy the contract," I urged, reaching for my backpack where we'd stored accelerant and matches. Breaking the physical binding might sever the spiritual one. Michael positioned himself protectively between the approaching figure and his wife. If this is about twins through the bloodline, why has he been appearing at other family events all these years? The answer came to me suddenly. He wasn't haunting, he was harvesting. Each significant family moment generated emotional energy he could use to sustain himself between the twin cycles. Births, deaths, weddings, they're all transitions, thresholds where reality thins. Martha's eyes widened with realization. That's why my daughter felt drawn to return to Millfield during her pregnancy. The pull of the contract was already affecting her, bringing her closer to him. The documents on our tarp began to smoke slightly, the blood ink seeming to liquefy though nothing had touched it. I hurriedly doused the parchment with the accelerant, but before I could strike a match, the fluid was absorbed completely into the ancient paper. "The contract is rejecting our attempt to destroy it," I said, horror creeping into my voice. Martha stepped forward suddenly, pulling the wedding band from the pile of artifacts. "This belongs to Elizabeth, not to him." She slipped it onto her finger alongside her own. The effect was instantaneous. The ghostly figure faltered mid-stride, his form wavering like heat distortion. A howl of rage echoed through the ruins, sending fragments of stone skittering across the ground. "The rings," I gasped, understanding breaking through. "They're conduits, not just symbols. Elizabeth's ring was never meant to stay here. It was supposed to be worn by the bride. By keeping it separate, Thorn maintained control over her spirit." Martha stood taller, both rings now glinting on her finger. "If I'm the 5th generation, not the 4th, then the pattern is already broken. Sarah tricked him. She wasn't just saving herself, she was creating a mathematical flaw in his own contract." Looking at the twins' photograph in the locket one final time, Martha closed her eyes and whispered, "Elizabeth, I release you from this bargain made without your consent." The ground beneath Elizabeth's grave cracked open with a sound like breaking glass. From the fissure rose a gentle light, coalescing into the form of a young woman in wedding attire, Elizabeth's spirit, bound to this place for over a century. Thorn's manifestation lunged toward her, elongated fingers grasping, but the spectral bride raised her hand in rejection. Where she gestured, his form dissolved into wisps of darkness. "A contract requires consent of both parties," Elizabeth's voice echoed, the first words she had spoken since her death. "I never gave mine." The contract on our tarp burst into blue flame, consuming itself without our intervention. As it burned, the binding sigils carved into Thorn's foundation stones began to bleed a dark substance, the ancient magic unraveling before our eyes. Through the flames, Elizabeth's spirit smiled at Martha with profound gratitude before turning her gaze toward the tree line, where a second luminous figure waited, her true bridegroom from a century past, finally reunited with the bride who had been stolen from him. The Millfield church ruins felt different as dawn broke the following day. Martha, Michael, and I returned to gather our scattered equipment and properly document what we'd discovered. The atmosphere had transformed, lighter, as though centuries of malevolent pressure had finally been released from the soil itself. Martha traced her fingers along Elizabeth's headstone, now clearly visible without the choking overgrowth that had previously concealed it. "My daughter called this morning. She and her husband have decided not to move back to Millfield after all. She said something just felt wrong about the idea. The generational pull is broken. I confirmed, carefully photographing the cornerstone cavity. Without the contract binding your bloodline, the compulsion to return has disappeared. As we worked, an elderly man approached from the main road, observing our activities with curious eyes. He introduced himself as Harold Pearson, a local historian whose family had lived in Millfield for 6 generations. "Heard there was activity up at the old church," he said, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. "Nobody comes here anymore except vandals and the occasional ghost hunter. You folks look more serious than that." When Martha explained our connection to the church and the 19th century wedding, Harold's weathered face creased with recognition. "The Harmon twins," he nodded. "My grandfather spoke of them. Town never quite believed the official story. He agreed to meet us at the county library after we finished at the church. There, among archives too fragile to be digitized, Harold showed us a collection of Millfield Gazette clippings his family had preserved. "This might interest you," he said, carefully unfolding a brittle newspaper dated 1 week after the wedding. A small item near the bottom of the 3rd page caught my attention. "Local pastor confirms imposter. Reverend James Whitaker, recovering from illness, reports that no substitute minister was arranged for the Harmon Collins nuptials. Church authorities investigating unidentified man who performed ceremony." Another clipping from 2 weeks later reported that the investigation had been quietly abandoned at the family's request. A handwritten note in the margin, added decades later in faded blue ink, simply stated, "S paid for silence." "S for Sarah," Martha whispered. Harold nodded gravely. "There's more. My grandfather was just a boy then, but he remembered something odd about that day." He produced a small leather journal, the pages yellow with age. Inside, a childish scrawl described watching the bride's sister running from the church before the ceremony, pursued by a tall man in dark clothing. The account ended with the confused observation that when the wedding proceeded hours later, he couldn't tell which twin was walking down the aisle. "The family announced Elizabeth died of heart failure the night before," Harold explained. "But grandfather always insisted he saw both sisters alive that morning. No one believed a child's recollections against a prominent family's official statement." As we prepared to leave, Harold hesitated before handing Martha a faded envelope. "Found this years ago behind a loose baseboard when renovating my family home. Never knew what to do with it. The address suggests it belongs with your family history." Inside was an unmailed letter in Elizabeth's handwriting, dated the morning of her wedding day. Its contents were brief but chilling. "Dearest Mother, Sarah has made a terrible arrangement. If anything happens to me today, know it was not accident nor illness. I fear what she has promised in exchange for the life she covets. With love and terror, Elizabeth." The strangest revelation came 2 weeks after our discoveries at the church ruins. Martha's daughter Emma had gone through routine prenatal testing that revealed something the doctors called highly unusual. The twins she carried appeared to have different genetic markers in certain key areas, variations that couldn't be easily explained by normal genetic inheritance. The specialist said it's as though one twin has DNA markers from outside our family entirely, Emma explained during our video call, her face pale with concern. "They want to run additional tests, but they've never seen this pattern before." Martha and I exchanged glances, understanding the implications without needing to voice them. Somehow, Thorne's influence had extended beyond the spiritual realm into the physical, attempting to create a child that would truly belong to him, carrying his genetic imprint across time. But with the contract broken and his binding destroyed, what would happen to this partially altered twin? I consulted with Dr. Eliza Thornfield, a geneticist who specialized in hereditary anomalies and maintained an open mind about paranormal influences. After reviewing the anonymized test results, she offered a surprisingly hopeful assessment. "These markers appear to be reverting," she explained, pointing to comparative analyses from tests taken a week apart. "It's as if whatever was attempting to overwrite the natural genetic structure is retreating. I've never seen anything like it, but the trajectory suggests complete normalization before birth." Martha's family home yielded one final piece to our puzzle when they began renovations on the attic space. Behind a section of insulation that had clearly been disturbed decades earlier, Michael discovered a small leather diary with SH embossed on its cover. Sarah's private thoughts, hidden away for over a century, revealed the full extent of her bargain with Thorne. She hadn't merely switched places with her sister. She had actively facilitated Elizabeth's murder, leading her to the church basement where Thorne's spirit waited. "May God forgive what I cannot confess," she wrote in shaking script the night after her wedding. "I wear her ring, sleep beside her intended husband, and will bear children who should have been hers. The tall man promises this arrangement will hold so long as certain conditions are met through the generations." The final pages detailed her growing horror as she realized the true nature of their bargain. Thorne had never wanted Elizabeth as a bride. He wanted access to the bloodline, the ability to eventually incarnate through it when the conditions were right. Sarah's twins would have been his first opportunity, but she miscarried early in her pregnancy, temporarily thwarting his plan. "I have bought time with my sister's life," her final entry read, "but I cannot undo what is written in blood. I can only hope that someday, someone wiser than I will find a way to break what I have bound." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Sarah's desperate attempt to escape her own fate had created the generational curse that nearly claimed her descendants. Her deception had introduced the mathematical error in the contract that ultimately allowed us to break it. When Emma's twins were born 3 months later, 2 healthy girls with perfectly normal genetic markers, we knew the cycle had truly ended. Thorne's presence had been completely expunged from the family line, his carefully constructed path to incarnation closed forever. As Emma's twins celebrated their first birthday, I found myself drawn back to Millfield, compelled by questions that still lingered. Martha joined me, bringing a collection of fragile photographs recently discovered in her grandmother's hope chest. We sat in the renovated community center that had replaced the town's last cafe, spreading the images across a weathered oak table. "Look at these," Martha said, pointing to a series of candid shots from the 1920s. All these years we focused on who was in the photographs, never questioning who took them. The collection revealed a pattern I'd overlooked. While Thorne appeared as an unwelcome specter in family images taken by others, there existed another set, photographs of the family where his presence was notably absent. These bore no photographer's mark, no studio name. "Sarah took these," Martha whispered, the realization dawning simultaneously between us. She was documenting her stolen life. The composition of these images struck me immediately, each one meticulously framed to showcase her usurped identity. Here was Sarah with her husband, Sarah with her children, Sarah at community functions, each photograph a trophy, visual proof of her successful deception. She wasn't just recording memories, I noted. She was creating evidence of her rightful place in a life that wasn't hers. What disturbed me most was the evolution visible across decades of these self-documented moments. In earlier photographs, Sarah's expression contained hints of triumph, almost smugness. But as years passed, her eyes grew haunted, her posture increasingly rigid. By the 1940s, she appeared perpetually vigilant, her gaze often directed beyond the frame as though watching for something approaching. She knew he was circling closer, Martha observed, tracing her great-grandmother's tightened jawline in a later image. She recognized that her bargain was temporary, that eventually he would collect. Harold Pearson had provided one final historical document before we left Millfield, the deed to the church property. The land had passed through various owners before Thorne acquired it, but one name caught my attention: Abigail Winters, who sold the property in 1870 at a suspicious discount after owning it barely 3 months. County archives revealed that Abigail had twin daughters who disappeared that same year. "It wasn't just your family," I told Martha, showing her the records. "Thorne was fixated on twins specifically. Your great-grandmother wasn't his first target, just the first who managed to partially outwit him by creating the generational displacement." The librarian approached our table with a dusty ledger secured from township storage. "Found something you might want to see," she said, opening to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "Property surveys from 1868. The survey revealed something extraordinary. Beneath where the church was eventually built lay a natural formation of stones arranged in a perfect circle, a geological anomaly that early settlers had documented but never explained. Some places are thin by their very nature," I explained to Martha. Thorne didn't choose the location randomly. He identified a natural doorway and built his plans around it. As we gathered our research, Martha's phone chimed with a video call from Emma. On screen, her twins appeared, identical in every visible way except for one striking detail. The child on the left could see us through the screen, smiling and reaching toward her grandmother. The child on the right stared intently at something behind us, something no one else could see. The revelation about Emma's twins awakened a deeper anxiety within me. During our drive back from Millfield, Martha remained silent, her fingers nervously tracing the outline of Elizabeth's wedding band, which she now wore alongside her own ring. "The child was looking at something behind us," she finally whispered, "just like my grandmother described in her diary, seeing things others couldn't." I wanted to dismiss it as coincidental, a baby's wandering gaze misinterpreted through parental anxiety, but my years investigating paranormal phenomena had taught me to recognize patterns. While we had destroyed the contract and broken Thorne's specific binding, we hadn't addressed the natural doorway beneath the church ruins. "We closed one door," I admitted, "but the threshold remains." That night I dreamed of the stone circle buried beneath the church foundation. In my dream, I stood at its center while faceless figures moved clockwise around me, their whispers building into a discordant chant. I woke drenched in sweat, the phrase, "the circle completes," echoing in my mind. The following morning, I received an unexpected email from Harold Pearson. Attached was a scanned journal entry from his grandfather's youth, describing a local legend predating Thorne's arrival. According to folklore, indigenous tribes had avoided the natural stone circle, believing it to be a place where two worlds pressed too closely together. More disturbing was Harold's recent discovery while digitizing town records: 6 documented cases of twins born in Millfield across 3 centuries. In every instance, one twin died before reaching adulthood, often under circumstances deemed unexplained or mysterious. I called Martha immediately. "Thorne didn't create the pattern," I explained, my voice tight with urgency. "He exploited something that already existed, the twin births, the land itself. He manipulated a natural convergence." "What does this mean for Emma's daughters?" Martha asked, fear evident in her voice. Before I could respond, my phone chimed with another message. This one from Dr. Thornfield, who had continued monitoring the twins' unusual genetic markers out of scientific curiosity. "The anomalies haven't disappeared," she wrote. "They've transformed. Both twins now show identical variations that match neither parent's DNA. These markers appear in sections associated with perceptual processing, specifically visual cortex development." I thought of the baby staring beyond the camera, seeing what we couldn't. "The circle completes," I murmured, understanding dawning with horrible clarity. What if Thorne's plan hadn't been thwarted but merely transformed? What if, instead of claiming one twin for himself, his dissolution had somehow marked both children as threshold walkers, beings capable of perceiving across boundaries? The oldest stories warned that some doorways, once opened, could never truly be closed. They could only be guarded by those with the sight to see what might emerge. And in breaking Thorne's contract, we may have inadvertently created something unprecedented. Twin guardians bound not to him, but to the threshold itself. Emma's daughters turned 3 years old on a crisp autumn afternoon. Martha organized a small celebration at her home, away from Millfield and its lingering shadows. I watched the twins, Lily and Rose, as they played in the garden, their synchronized movements occasionally disrupted when one would pause, head tilted, attending to something invisible to adult eyes. "They're doing it again," Emma whispered, joining me by the window. Last week, Lily woke screaming about the tall man at the window. We live on the 14th floor. I'd been documenting the twins' development discreetly, noting patterns that defied conventional explanation. Both girls drew remarkably similar pictures: circular formations with stick figures standing equidistant around the perimeter. When asked, they called it the waiting room. "There's something else," Emma continued, pulling her phone from her pocket. "I recorded this yesterday." The video showed the twins playing with alphabet blocks. As I watched, they methodically arranged the letters, working in perfect tandem without speaking. When finished, the blocks spelled, "Threshold needs watchers." "They shouldn't be able to spell words this complex," Emma said, and afterward, they had no memory of doing it. Martha joined us, Elizabeth's wedding band glinting on her finger beside her own. Since wearing the twin rings, she'd begun having dreams of Elizabeth. Not frightening encounters, but conversations across a boundary. Information passed between them. Insights about the nature of the threshold beneath Millfield. "Elizabeth believes the twins weren't claimed by Thorne," Martha explained, watching the girls through the window. "They were claimed by the threshold itself. When we destroyed Thorne's contract, we created a vacuum of guardianship. The doorway requires watchers." Dr. Thornfield's latest analysis showed further changes in the twins' unique genetic markers. They were stabilizing, becoming a coherent pattern rather than random variations. More remarkably, brain scans revealed unprecedented neural activity in areas associated with extrasensory perception. "They're evolving," Dr. Thornfield had explained, adapting to perceive wavelengths beyond normal human capacity. That evening, after the birthday celebrations concluded and other guests departed, Martha, Emma, Michael, and I gathered in the kitchen while the exhausted twins slept upstairs. "We need to make a decision," I said quietly. "Either we continue treating this as something to be fixed, or we accept that the twins have become something necessary, guardians of a boundary we barely understand." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "How can I raise children whose purpose is to watch for things that shouldn't exist? Who might be taken by whatever waits on the other side?" Martha reached across the table, taking her daughter's hand. "Elizabeth says there's another option. The threshold has always needed twins, one facing our world, one facing theirs. But they don't have to be children." I understood immediately. "You're suggesting a transfer of guardianship?" Martha nodded, touching the twin rings on her finger. "Elizabeth and I, we're twins across the boundary now. We share blood, we share purpose. The girls deserve normal lives." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling windows as though something listened, considering this proposal from both sides of an ancient doorway. The ritual took place during the winter solstice, when the boundary between worlds grew naturally thinner. We gathered in Martha's living room, transformed by carefully placed silver mirrors and salt lines, forming concentric circles around a center space where Martha sat alone. The twins slept peacefully upstairs, monitored by Michael and Emma, while Dr. Thornfield stood ready with medical equipment should anything go amiss. "The transfer requires symmetry," I explained, positioning the final mirror to reflect Martha's face back upon itself. "Elizabeth will approach from her side while you reach from yours." Martha wore both wedding bands now, one on each hand. She'd spent weeks in preparation, fasting, meditation, and conversations with Elizabeth through dreams that left her exhausted but increasingly certain. The journal we discovered among Sarah's possessions had provided crucial details about the threshold's nature and the requirements for guardianship. The twins were never meant to bear this burden, Martha whispered as she settled into position. "Some bargains can be renegotiated." As the clock struck midnight, Martha closed her eyes and extended her hands, palms upward. The temperature in the room plummeted despite the roaring fireplace. Frost patterns formed on the mirrors, intricate whorls that resembled the circular formations the twins had drawn throughout the past year. "I offer myself as watcher." Martha's voice emerged stronger than expected, resonating with unexpected depth. "Elizabeth and I, divided by death but united by blood, will stand guard so others need not." The flames in the fireplace flared suddenly blue, casting eerie shadows across the walls. In each mirror appeared not Martha's reflection but Elizabeth's face, young, determined, wearing her wedding dress from a century before. A sound like rushing water filled the room as reality seemed to buckle inward. Dr. Thornfield's instruments shrieked with feedback before shutting down completely. The salt lines glowed with soft phosphorescence, pulsing like a heartbeat. Upstairs, both twins woke simultaneously, sitting upright in bed. Emma later described how they turned to each other, nodded once in perfect understanding, then peacefully returned to sleep. Within our circle, Martha's form appeared to flicker, sometimes solid, sometimes transparent, as though existing in two places simultaneously. Her voice, when she spoke again, carried dual tones, her own intertwined with Elizabeth's higher pitch. "The threshold accepts our guardianship," they said together. "The children are released." As dawn approached, the phenomena gradually subsided. Martha remained physically present, but fundamentally altered. The genetic markers that had distinguished the twins now appeared in her blood samples instead. The wedding bands had fused together on her finger, impossible to separate without breaking them. "I see everything now," she told us afterward, her eyes holding depths that hadn't existed before. "Both sides at once." Elizabeth and I trade places as needed, one in each world, watching, protecting. Dr. Thornfield's follow-up examinations of the twins showed completely normal readings. Their unusual abilities faded gradually over subsequent months, leaving two ordinary little girls who retained no memories of their brief role as threshold watchers. Martha, however, would never be the same again. The quiet transformation of Martha from concerned grandmother to threshold guardian manifested in subtle ways that only I noticed at first. Her home in the suburbs remained unchanged, but Martha herself developed uncanny awareness of her surroundings. She would answer the doorbell seconds before it rang, turn to address visitors who hadn't yet announced themselves, and sometimes pause mid-conversation to listen to voices no one else could hear. The threshold requires balance, she explained during one of our documentation sessions. When Elizabeth watches from her side, I experience what she perceives. When I guard, she lives through my senses. More concerning were the entries in Martha's journal, which she now kept in two distinct handwritings. The pages contained detailed accounts of entities that occasionally tested the boundaries, pressing against the threshold with increasing frequency. They're drawn to the twins, Martha's entries revealed. Not to harm them, but because the girls briefly held the role of watchers. Their essence lingers on the threshold like perfume, attracting attention from the other side. During my research into similar cases, I discovered references to threshold pairs throughout history, twins who developed unusual perceptive abilities before mysteriously returning to normalcy. In each instance, historical records mentioned an older relative who subsequently exhibited changed behavior, often becoming reclusive or developing what contemporaries described as second sight. We're not the first to make this arrangement, Martha confirmed when I shared these findings. The threshold has always needed guardians. Before Thorne's interference, the transfer happened naturally when the twins reached adulthood. Emma noticed changes in her mother as well, particularly Martha's newfound fascination with mirrors. She positioned them throughout her home at precise angles, explaining they weren't mere reflections but windows Elizabeth could use to glimpse our world when necessary. Mom will sometimes speak to her reflection using phrases and references from Elizabeth's era, Emma confided. It's unsettling, but the girls haven't had a single episode since the transfer. No strange drawings, no unexplained knowledge, no seeing things that aren't there. The most profound evidence came 6 months after the ritual, when Harold Pearson contacted me about seismic activity detected beneath the Millfield Church ruins. University geologists had installed monitoring equipment after detecting unusual magnetic anomalies at the site. The readings show a perfect circle of stability, Harold explained, sending me the technical reports. While the surrounding area registers normal geological shifts, the exact circumference of the original stone formation shows zero movement, as though something holds it perfectly still. When I mentioned this to Martha, she smiled knowingly. The threshold is settling. With proper guardianship restored, it no longer needs to search for watchers. What none of us anticipated was how Martha's new role would affect her perceived age. Though 62 when we performed the ritual, she now appeared markedly younger in photographs, a phenomenon Dr. Thornfield attributed to cellular restructuring related to the genetic changes we'd documented. Time moves differently at thresholds, Martha explained. Elizabeth and I balance each other across the boundary, neither fully in one world or the other. 3 years passed since Martha became threshold guardian, and my documentation of her transformation grew into a comprehensive study that challenged everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between worlds. Winter had settled once more over the countryside as I drove to her home for our monthly interview, the car's headlights cutting through early evening darkness. Martha greeted me at the door before I knocked, her appearance now stabilized at what seemed to be her early 40s, a physical manifestation of the balance she maintained with Elizabeth across the threshold. The house smelled of tea and old books, comfort mingled with ancient knowledge. "You've brought a guest today," she observed, her eyes focusing slightly beyond my shoulder. I turned, seeing nothing but the empty hallway. "Martha? Not a physical visitor," she clarified, leading me to her study where journals filled with dual handwriting covered her desk. "Something follows you. Has been for weeks now. I wondered when you'd bring it close enough for proper examination." A chill ran through me. My recent research had taken me to 3 other sites with reported threshold phenomena, none as well documented as Millfield, but each bearing striking similarities. At the last location, an abandoned lighthouse in Maine, I'd experienced unexplained equipment failures and the unsettling sensation of being observed. "The lighthouse keeper," Martha said, confirming my unspoken thoughts. "He's curious about you, about why you navigate so close to boundaries without crossing." Emma arrived with the twins, now healthy 6-year-olds who bounded into the room with normal childish energy, showing no trace of their earlier peculiarities. They hugged their grandmother before racing upstairs to play, blissfully unaware of the supernatural inheritance they'd narrowly escaped. "The girls have been invited to a birthday party next weekend," Emma mentioned casually. "Twins from their school. The mothers are identical sisters." Martha and I exchanged significant glances, the pattern continuing, twins drawing twins like recognizing like across generations. "I'll speak with the mothers," Martha said calmly. Some families have carried the watching tradition knowingly for centuries. They might simply need guidance. Later, as Martha prepared tea in the kitchen, I noticed her briefly go still, head tilting toward the ceiling as though listening. When she returned, her posture had subtly changed, shoulders set differently, movements more formal. "Elizabeth has something to show you," Martha explained, her voice carrying the dual tones I'd grown accustomed to. Without another word, she led me to the mirror in the hallway, gesturing for me to look closely. My reflection appeared normal for several seconds before the background behind me shifted. Instead of Martha's hallway, I saw the Millfield Church as it had been in 1909, whole, pristine, surrounded by wedding guests. In the doorway stood Edmund Thorne, watching not the ceremony, but looking directly at me across more than a century, his expression not malevolent but resigned. "He was never the true threat," Martha Elizabeth's voice explained. "Merely another prisoner of the threshold, desperate to escape its pull. The daughters of each generation are always safe. It's the watchers who pay the price." The lighthouse keeper from Maine materialized in Martha's study 3 days after my unsettling mirror experience. Not as a spectral apparition, but as an elderly man with weathered features and salt-crusted boots who simply appeared seated in her reading chair when she entered the room at dawn. "The boundaries are thinning," he announced without introduction, his voice carrying the rhythmic cadence of waves against rock. "Not just at Millfield, everywhere." Martha nodded as if she'd been expecting him. "You've been watching our researcher." "Threshold guardians recognize each other," he replied, eyes shifting toward me as I stood frozen in the doorway, having arrived moments earlier for an unscheduled visit drawn by inexplicable urgency. "There are 19 of us left. There were 37 when I began my watch in 1938. Martha Elizabeth settled opposite him, twin rings glinting as she poured tea that somehow waited steaming on the table between them. "The pattern is accelerating." "Because of the children," the lighthouse keeper confirmed. "The twins who were briefly marked but released. They created a new template, a possibility that breaks the ancient cycle. Others have noticed." I found my voice at last. "Others?" His weathered face turned toward mine. "Watchers can transfer guardianship willingly, as Martha demonstrated. But what she couldn't know is that such transfers weaken the threshold itself. Each renegotiation creates a flexibility in boundaries once absolute. The implications chilled me. "The twins at Emma's daughter's school are the 19th pair born within 500 miles of Millfield since your ritual," he finished. "Twin births near thresholds have increased 7-fold worldwide. The balance is shifting." Martha's expression remained calm, but I noted Elizabeth's handwriting spontaneously appearing in her open journal. Urgent notations in antique script describing pressure building on her side of the boundary. "Something wants through," Martha whispered, voice entirely her own, yet filled with Elizabeth's fear. "Not Thorne. Something that has waited much longer." The lighthouse keeper nodded gravely. "The thresholds were never meant to protect us from single entities, but from what lies beyond all boundaries. The spaces between worlds where nothing has form, but everything has hunger." Understanding crystallized with terrible clarity. We hadn't merely transferred guardianship from Emma's twins to Martha and Elizabeth. We demonstrated that the ancient contract could be rewritten. Each threshold around the world now faced similar challenges. Ancient guardians being approached by families desperate to spare their children. "We've accelerated something that can't be stopped," I realized aloud. Martha stood suddenly, her shadow splitting impossibly into 2 distinct silhouettes against the wall. Her own and Elizabeth's wedding-dressed form. "Not stopped," she corrected, "but redirected. We need all threshold guardians gathered at Millfield during next month's equinox." The lighthouse keeper's expression shifted to something approaching hope. "A conclave hasn't been attempted since 1627. The watchers must stand together," Martha declared, her voice resonating with both her own determination and Elizabeth's century of patient observation. "Either all boundaries hold, or none will." The conclave of threshold guardians arrived with the equinox tide. 17 watchers gathering at Millfield Church ruins under a sky split between day and night. They came without physical travel, simply appearing at the appointed hour, each bearing marks of their vigil. The lighthouse keeper's salt-crusted boots, an elderly woman's eyes that reflected starlight even at noon, twins in their 90s who finished each other's sentences across continents. Martha Elizabeth guided them to the precise center of the stone circle, now exposed after we'd spent weeks carefully excavating the church foundation. What we uncovered defied archaeological understanding. The stones weren't merely positioned in a circle, but had grown that way, curved monoliths emerging from the earth like teeth from gums. The truth was never about Thorn or Sarah's bargain, Martha explained as the Guardians formed their own circle atop the ancient one. Those were merely symptoms of something far older. The lighthouse keeper nodded solemnly. Each threshold forms naturally where reality folded back on itself during Earth's creation. Like scars from an ancient injury, they mark points where our world nearly tore apart. And the twins? I asked, standing outside their circle as designated witness. The first pairs of twins born near thresholds weren't fully human, replied the starlight-eyed woman. They were reality's natural attempt at creating guardians, one child anchored to each side of the fold. Martha Elizabeth continued. Indigenous peoples understood this. They honored threshold twins as sacred, never separating them. When European colonization disrupted these traditions, the thresholds began seeking guardians more desperately. The truth revealed itself with terrible clarity. Thorn hadn't created the haunting pattern, but had merely exploited a natural phenomenon already in crisis. The true pattern stretched back millennia. Twins born near thresholds were meant to serve as balanced guardians, one perceiving each side while physically anchored in their native reality. The industrial era accelerated the damage, explained the ancient twins simultaneously. Iron railways cutting through ley lines, concrete foundations poured over sacred sites, electric lights burning away the darkness where boundaries naturally thin. What truly waits beyond isn't a collection of spirits or demons, Martha Elizabeth said, voice resonating with impossible depth. It's the unformed potential that existed before reality crystallized into distinct worlds, a consciousness without structure, desperate to experience form again. As the Guardians joined hands, completing their circle upon the threshold's circle, the air between them shimmered. Through this distortion, I glimpsed what Elizabeth had watched for a century. Not darkness, but blinding possibility. Colors without names swirling in patterns that hurt my mind to perceive. This is what seeks the twins, Martha Elizabeth explained. Not to harm them, but to experience physical existence through them. Each pair of threshold twins represents perfect balance, the ideal vessels for containing unbound consciousness. Our ritual hadn't weakened the boundaries. It had demonstrated that willing guardianship was stronger than forced service. The conclave now sought to establish a new covenant with the thresholds themselves, offering conscious stewardship rather than fearful watching. As their combined voices rose in languages both known and forgotten, I understood the true horror. Not that something wanted in, but that reality itself had always been more permeable than we could bear to know. The revelation of reality's permeable nature rippled through me as I documented the Guardian's covenant. The conclave lasted 9 hours, during which Millfield existed in twilight regardless of the sun's actual position. Threshold Guardians spoke in harmonized voices, establishing new terms with the ancient force that pressed against our reality's fabric. When they finished, Martha appeared completely transformed. The physical merger with Elizabeth had stabilized completely, her face now a perfect blend of her own features and her great-grandmother's sister, visible in the century-old photographs. The twin rings had melted together into a Mobius band that encircled her finger like a metallic infinity symbol. "The agreement is made," she announced, her voice no longer shifting between two entities but permanently harmonized. Willing guardianship freely given in exchange for the twins' protection. "What does this mean for the children?" Emma asked, clutching her daughter's hands as they slept peacefully in the car parked safely beyond the stone circle. "They remain free," the lighthouse keeper assured her, "but they will always be recognized by what waits beyond. They must never stand upon thresholds during equinoxes or solstices." In the weeks that followed, I pieced together the true scope of our discovery. Threshold guardians worldwide reported the same phenomenon. Twin births returning to historical averages rather than the alarming spike we'd witnessed. The desperate pressure against reality's boundaries had eased, replaced by what Martha described as respectful observation. The cost became apparent as well. Each guardian had surrendered something essential, not years of life, but the ability to exist fully in one reality. Martha could never again leave the vicinity of Millfield's threshold. The lighthouse keeper would forever walk the rocky shores of Maine. They had become anchors, willingly tethered to their posts. Most profound was the shift in our understanding of human history. Ancient structures like Stonehenge, Newgrange, and countless other stone circles worldwide weren't merely ceremonial sites or astronomical calendars. They were humanity's earliest attempts to stabilize thresholds, to create permanent guardianship through architecture when willing watchers couldn't be found. Dr. Thornfield's genetic research revealed markers in approximately 3% of the global population, indicating descent from threshold twins. These individuals often reported heightened intuition, precognitive dreams, or the subtle sense of another presence sharing their consciousness, echoes of an ancient role their ancestors once served. "We aren't restoring the original system," Martha explained during our final documentation session. "We're evolving it, conscious guardianship instead of instinctive watching." As I prepared my research for secure archiving, Emma brought the twins to bid farewell to their grandmother. Though Martha would continue living in her home, she had become something beyond fully human, a hybrid consciousness maintaining equal presence in two adjacent realities. "Will we ever see the things you see?" Lily asked, innocent curiosity in her voice. Martha smiled, bending to embrace her granddaughters. "You already did once, but your gift now is ordinary perception, the miracle of seeing one world fully rather than two worlds partially." The unbound consciousness beyond our reality had reached an understanding with its watchers. Not peace exactly, but negotiated coexistence across a boundary that would hold, not because it couldn't be broken, but because both sides now recognized the value of separation. The final documentation of the Millfield threshold phenomenon brought me back to the photograph that had started everything, the 1909 wedding image with its mysterious figure. Martha had placed it in a silver frame etched with protective symbols, displayed neither prominently nor hidden, but positioned precisely where the afternoon light would touch it daily for exactly 7 minutes. The photograph itself became a minor threshold, Martha explained, her harmonized voice gentle as she adjusted its position slightly. "A paper-thin doorway through which Thorn first manifested in your world." I watched as she passed her hand over the image, the motion causing the photograph to shift subtly, like ripples across water. The mysterious figure behind the bride, once the center of our investigation, had transformed. Where Thorn once stood now, appeared a luminous feminine silhouette that unmistakably belonged to Elizabeth, her features serene rather than haunted. "She stands there now," Martha confirmed, watching through the photograph as I watched through mirrors. "Every threshold requires balance." Emma had preserved the original wedding registry and marriage certificate, now understanding their true significance. Not as mere historical records, but as physical components of the binding that had inadvertently strengthened Thorn's connection. These documents now rested in a lead-lined box embedded with silver wire, secured in a university archive, under the innocuous label, "Early 20th Century Marriage Customs." The twins had developed normally following our intervention, their exceptional genetic markers gradually fading until only the faintest trace remained, enough to keep them instinctively away from places where reality grew thin, but insufficient to attract attention from beyond the threshold. They would continue Martha's bloodline without carrying her burden. Harold Pearson's historical documentation of Millfield had expanded to include carefully coded references to the threshold phenomenon, embedded within seemingly ordinary town records, a breadcrumb trail for future researchers who might encounter similar manifestations. The lighthouse keeper had established corresponding archives at 37 identified threshold locations across the globe, creating a network of knowledge designed to survive even if individual guardians faltered. Sarah's diary found its final resting place in Martha's study, its confessions neither condemned nor forgiven, but preserved as testament to how desperation could lead to bargains with forces beyond understanding. The last entry, previously overlooked beneath a stuck page, revealed her eventual comprehension of what she'd done. "I sought escape through my sister's sacrifice, only to discover I had bound us both to opposite sides of the same prison. May those who follow find wisdom I lacked." The wedding photograph had one final secret to reveal, discovered only when Dr. Thornfield examined it using specialized equipment that detected trace biological materials. The photograph paper contained microscopic amounts of blood mixed into the emulsion, creating a literal blood document that had served as Thorn's anchor for decades. "Photographs capture more than light," Martha observed, as we carefully neutralized this final connection. "They capture moments when reality holds still long enough to be perceived in a single frame." The danger was never in what the photograph showed, but in what it allowed to see us. Through the autumn that followed, quiet transformations settled across the threshold sites worldwide. I traveled between them, documenting the new equilibrium, watching as ancient places once haunted by desperation now held a strange serenity. The Guardians communicated across vast distances without technology, their consciousness partially merged with the boundaries they protected. During my final visit to Millfield before completing my research, I found Martha tending a garden of night-blooming flowers arranged in concentric circles around the threshold stones. The plants thrived despite the first frost having already touched the surrounding countryside. "They grow on both sides simultaneously," she explained, her fingers gently brushing petals that seemed to shimmer between substance and translucence. "Elizabeth nurtures them in her reality, as I tend them in ours. The blooms exist in both worlds at once." What Martha couldn't yet perceive, though I suspected she would soon enough, was how the Guardians themselves were gradually becoming like these flowers. With each passing month, the distinction between Watcher and Threshold blurred further. They weren't merely guarding the boundaries. They were becoming the boundaries incarnate. Emma had begun dreaming again, though not nightmares of thorn or unnamed ancient hungers. She described landscapes that couldn't exist in our world, architecture that followed impossible geometries, skies where multiple suns cast overlapping shadows. Yet these visions brought no terror, only a profound sense of witnessing something meant to remain separate but not unknown. "The twins sketch what I dream," she confided during my visit, without me telling them. Their drawings revealed mathematical patterns that quantum physicists would recognize as wave function visualizations, the probability maps of reality's foundational structure. Children across the world connected to former Threshold twins had begun producing similar artwork, unconsciously documenting the architecture of our universe's boundaries. I understood then what the Conclave had truly accomplished. Not merely a new covenant with forces beyond our reality, but the beginning of humanity's conscious relationship with the multiverse itself. We were evolving from accidental participants to aware custodians, our perception expanding beyond the single slice of existence we'd previously recognized as the whole of creation. Martha stood at the center of it all, not by choice or ambition, but through the strange mathematics of blood and circumstance that had positioned her bloodline at precisely the right juncture of time and space. When she looked at me that final evening, illuminated by her impossible flowers under a waxing moon, I glimpsed briefly what she had become, a being simultaneously present in adjacent realities, perception flowing unimpeded across boundaries that separated worlds. "It was never about haunting or possession," she said, answering my unspoken question. "Those were merely our limited understanding of contact. What waits beyond doesn't wish to invade. It wishes to be recognized." As I prepared to close my research journals for the final time, I understood that our story hadn't ended but transformed, from a tale of supernatural horror into something far more profound. The first conscious conversation between neighboring realities in the vast architecture of existence. The photograph that started our journey now rests in the University of Chicago's esoteric archives, sealed in a specially constructed case of silver, glass, and salt-infused resin. Its placement was Martha's final request before she fully merged with the Threshold, becoming neither fully human nor entirely other, but something necessarily in between. I visit annually on the anniversary of our discovery, watching how the image continues its slow transformation. The wedding gathering remains frozen in that moment from 1909, but the background shifts subtly depending on which reality casts the stronger light across the boundary that day. Sometimes the church appears whole, sometimes ruined. Occasionally, if one looks at precisely the right angle, both states exist simultaneously. Emma's twins graduated college last spring, their lives gloriously ordinary despite their brief role in cosmic architecture. They avoid mirrors during equinoxes and instinctively step around certain spots where reality grows thin, but otherwise live unburdened by threshold awareness. Their children, should they choose to have them, will carry only the faintest genetic echo of their brush with what lies beyond. Threshold Guardians worldwide have established a quiet network of watchers, not to prevent crossing but to ensure mutual respect between neighboring realities. Ancient sites once dismissed as superstitious gathering places have been rediscovered as sophisticated boundary maintenance systems, humanity's earliest attempt to comprehend the permeable nature of existence. Dr. Thornfield's research revolutionized quantum physics, though few understand the true source of her insights. Her papers on adjacency perception and threshold genetics established new fields of study without revealing the threshold children who inspired her work. Some mysteries require gradual revelation. Harold Pearson passed away peacefully last winter at 97. His extensive Millfield archives continue providing carefully coded information for those with eyes to recognize it. The lighthouse keeper still walks his rocky Maine shoreline, aging at a pace measured in centuries rather than decades, watching the boundary where sea meets land meets something else entirely. I've largely withdrawn from active investigation, focusing instead on teaching selected students to recognize threshold phenomena without fear. My specialized seminar at the university remains deliberately misnamed Folklore and Photographic Anomalies, attracting precisely the minds receptive to understanding, without needing explicit revelation. Yesterday, a student brought me a family photograph from 1976 showing a birthday celebration in Albuquerque. In the background, partially obscured by festive decorations, stands a figure with Martha's face but Elizabeth's posture, watching the proceedings with serene attention. The student reported her grandmother recently began speaking of the kind woman who visits through mirrors, bringing messages from relatives long departed. I recognized the pattern immediately. Another threshold forming, another guardian gradually emerging. Not a haunting, but a conversation between adjacent realities, conducted through bloodlines receptive to the dialogue. The boundaries between worlds have always been more suggestion than barrier, and those with the sight to perceive both sides have never been cursed but blessed with deeper understanding of existence itself. Another photograph, another dark secret revealed. Until next time, this has been Shadow Frames.